Okay, hello everyone. This is the 11 o'clock session in the alumni room. And this is There is no such thing as a normal user by Karl Groves. So if you're joining us online, please place your questions in the Q&A panel rather than the chat panel, as the chat will not be moderated. For attendees here in the room, if you have a question, wait for me to get to you with the microphone so that everyone can hear what you are asking. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible. If we don't get to them, some presenters will join the chat later and try to answer them individually. Our next speaker, Karl Groves, CEO and founder of, is it Affixed? Affixed, okay. Will speak to us about how the variety of combinations of browsers, operating systems, screen sizes, devices, assistive technology, and more make the notion of a normal user absurd. He will share the math behind this concept and best practices for universal design towards a more inclusive web. Please join me in welcoming Karl Groves.
Did you want me to go ahead and get started? Okay. All right. So, yeah, my name is Karl Groves. First off, I guess before I get started, I just want to give the organizers a round of applause for even doing this. It's really awesome. And I am super, super excited to be here. And this was me when I found out that they wanted me to come visit. Yeah. Timely. All right. So, I assume a lot of the people in this room are web developers, right? And so what platforms do you support? Do you have a support matrix here at ASU of like what browsers and operating systems and stuff like that? Do you have like most people would be like, oh well, we support Chrome and Edge and Safari and Firefox, right? And your designers, whoever's a designer designing this stuff, they might even target specific viewport sizes, right? They're going to be like, we will support 1400 by 1050 or something like that, right? And if you have UX folks on the team, they might even develop personas. Does everybody know what a persona is? Anybody want to volunteer a definition of a persona? I'll go ahead and this guy raised his hand. So yeah.
I'd say it's just like a representation of a certain type of user that your product or website is intended for.
Yeah, exactly. So you might have people, you've developed certain personas. You might even use those personas in the development of user stories when you're developing a piece of software. So your user story might be, worded as something like, as a student, I would like to X so I can Y, right? But all you've really done when you've developed the personas, developed the support matrix, developed the viewport sizes that you're going to support for is define what you think a normal user is. But is that really what you have? So as web developers, again, we talked about these definitions of, we're going to support people on Chrome and Windows 11 or whatever. We might support as far back as Windows 10 if we have really ancient stuff or something like that. And so we define normal as, conforming to a standard, usual, typical, they're expected. And I'm gonna sort of mess your world up real quick. So let's talk first off in terms of the total environments that we can expect to experience users of software and the web is going to be three types of environments, right? Desktop, mobile phone, and tablet. You might see people browsing the web on a television. Usually that's people browsing like YouTube, right? If it's on a television, they're browsing YouTube. But it could be Amazon or something like that. You could have one of those cool refrigerators that have the screen on it that has that, and you can browse the web on it. But let's face it, this is what we're really talking about: desktop, mobile, or is it? Okay, so for those, let's talk a little bit about browsers. So desktop browsers, we have Chrome and Edge and Firefox and Safari. We don't have Internet Explorer on there anymore. I mean, yeah, you really don't. Opera, Vivaldi, Lynx, right? Those are the browsers that we have. So we have seven browsers. Lynx is on there. This is really weird, by the way. Does anybody know what Lynx is? We're giving our ages away by nodding our heads. I saw you do that. Lynx was a text-only browser. And what's really weird is that the fact that a lot of you younger ones don't know about this is valid, because you're like Lynx, like who the heck uses a text-only browser? These are browsers that access my website. So I have a bunch of old geeks coming to my site, I guess. But Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari, I have seen Internet Explorer. That's why it's on there, because it's in my analytics. So this takes us to 7 Windows browsers, 7 Mac OS browsers, 1 Chrome OS browser, of course, and Linux has 17 different browsers. This gives us a possible combinations on the desktop of 32 different browsers. For mobile, under iOS, the only thing you have available to you is WebKit. On Android, you have WebKit, Blink, Gecko, and KHTML. There's some other, there's like a couple of other mobile operating systems, Symbian, Fire OS, and things like that. But I've never seen those in my analytics. These are from my analytics. So we're at 37 combinations of browsers and operating systems so far. Now let's talk about screen resolution. So with screen resolution, this is when things start getting really, really complicated. And again, these are all based on my own website's analytics. Yours could be different. They could be more complex. The analytics on my site show 12 distinct viewports. There's actually over 100 viewports in my analytics, but 12 of those viewports represent the top 98% of my traffic. So with the rest of the other viewports at under 1% each. So this is what we're talking about. There's 420 combinations of these, of my awesome, there we go. These are all 420, I'm sorry. These are all 12 of the screen resolutions that access my site. And so when we combine the operating systems, browsers, and screen resolutions, that means we have now 420 different combinations of normal. So now let's talk about disabilities. So you guys, if this is your first accessibility conference, get used to start hearing all these numbers about the types of disabilities that are out there and the percentage of people with disabilities. 27% of the people in the United States have a disability of some kind. There's a little asterisk there because basically when you deal with these kind of numbers, who counts the information or how you define the disability is going to significantly impact that percentage that you get. So for instance, the Department of Education's definition of disability is different than the Department of Labor's definition of disability because of the fact that the Department of Education is defining disability as whether somebody can get access to education, whereas Department of Labor is whether you can get a job. You guys know all this sort of stuff. In all of the accessibility standards that you're likely to hear about, be that Section 508 or EN 301-549 or RGAA or BITV, any of those, that basically they're all going to orient themselves around 6 different disability types. So if any of you have read Section 508, like let's say you had a bad case of insomnia and you wanted to go to sleep, you would see there's a section on what's called functional performance. EN 301-549 has that as well. And functional performance criteria defines the specific populations of people that they consider to be disabled and by these different population sizes. So we have blind, low vision, mobility impaired, speech impaired, cognitively impaired, and apparently cutoff is hearing impaired. So those are the 6 that are going to be counted for in your basic disability standards. There's obviously a lot more, and there's a lot more nuance and all that sort of stuff. But in the digital accessibility standards, that's what they're focused on. Within that, there are subtypes. So visual impairments, there's an asterisk here because there's way more than just this. In when it comes to visual impairments, there's basically under blindness and low vision, you'll have partial blindness, complete blindness, and legal blindness. A lot of times when we think of a person who's blind, we think that like the world is black and they don't see anything, but that's not really true. There is a certain point between low vision and blindness where they get into what we call legal blindness, and that's just loss of visual acuity to a certain extent, to where it's not considered useful vision. At any rate, there's obviously a lot of different things that can be considered blind and also low vision. Lower visual acuity, of course, light and glare sensitivity, contrast sensitivity, etc. So the types of assistive technologies that these users use are going to be a couple of different things. First off, could be screen readers. And so there are 11 screen reader combinations for Windows, 2 for Mac OS, 1 for Chrome OS, 1 for Linux. And then on mobile, there's iOS only has 1, of course, it's VoiceOver. Android has 4. And anything other than the normal Android talkback, all the rest of them are crap, but there's still 4 of them, and we have to consider those. Okay, under hearing impairments, there's 4-ish. Sensory neural hearing loss, conductive hearing loss, mixed hearing loss, auditory neuropathy, spectrum disorder. And then we get into motor impairments. And this is what gets really, really interesting, because as I've gone through these, by the way, the actual population size, this is something I always want to sort of highlight for people who are new to accessibility, is when you get into accessibility, you're going to start hearing screen reader, screen reader, screen reader, screen reader, screen reader. And in terms of actual population size, the number of blind people accessing your site on the screen reader is way lower than the people with cognitive impairments. Okay. So all the standards and all that sort of stuff have this sort of outsized focus on people who are blind because, yeah, interacting on the web as basically a highly visual medium, hearing the UI through your speakers, yeah, there's a lot to consider there. But population-wise, there are more people who are low vision than who are blind. There are more people who are hearing impaired than who are blind and low vision combined. There are more people who are motor impaired than hearing impaired, blind, and low vision combined. And there are more than twice as many people who have cognitive impairments than all of those combined. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight that as you're getting into this stuff. Motor impairments. I don't even know how many different combinations of motor impairments there are. About 12% of adults have a mobility impairment of some kind. Now, the number of different, has anybody here heard of WebAIM? Okay, WebAIM is an organization out of University of Utah State University, yes. They're a nonprofit organization out of Utah State University. They've been around as long as anybody else has in this, and I heartily recommend getting on their discussion list. They have an email discussion list that goes back all the way into the mid-90s. My first post there was 1990. No, not that long ago. I'm sorry. My first post there was like 2003. Anyway, really friendly discussion list, like not lots of arguing and politics and flame wars and all the other shit that we're used to online these days. It's actually a great environment. But anyway, they do this survey every year, and or they do a survey on screen readers. They do a survey on low vision. They've done one motor disability survey. The total number of motor disability types that they tracked in that is 9. So there's 9 of those. 22% of the respondents to that specific survey also said they had multiple disabilities. And so that's the other thing to keep in mind when you're starting to get into accessibility, is that we talk about personas, and it's great to have defined personas because we can write user stories around them and all that kind of stuff. But the thing about it is there is no such thing as like Joe Schmo, the blind user, who's going to be our persona, because Joe Schmo, the blind user, could also have cognitive impairments. I know a blind person who's dyslexic. I honestly don't know how that works, but I can tell you that it happens. So when we're talking about disabilities, the phrase you should remember is disability rarely travels alone. Another case in point, I have a friend who's blind. She's been blind since she was 3 years old. She's got a really rare form of cancer that for some reason continues to come back. And all the chemotherapy and radiation, all that sort of stuff has also left her with short-term memory loss, right? So she's non-visual and also has cognitive impairments. Very, very common for people to have that. All right. So the total number of ATs employed by people with mobility impairments when using a desktop computer is 10. The number of OS level settings employed by users with mobility impairments when using a desktop or laptop computer is 4. 36% of users with mobility impairments use special accessibility settings or software on their mobile device. 94% of users with motor impairments use a mainstream mobile device. Cognitive impairments, like I just mentioned before, cognitive impairments are so numerous and so complex that we actually, when we refer to cognitive impairments, we basically talk about them in terms of 6 functional groupings. And the functional groupings can be in any sort of combination depending on the specific cognitive impairments. And similar to what I was talking about when I said disability rarely travels alone, it's definitely the case with cognitive impairments. It's very common for kids with dyslexia to also have attention deficit disorders. Dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia can all come into play in the same single person. So again, disability rarely travels alone. 13% of adults have a cognition disability with serious difficulty concentrating, remembering, or making decisions. So when you add in disabilities, you get 1,221 different combinations of normal. And when we add in the different combinations of the platform, operating system and browser, we're up to 14,000 different possibilities of normal. Some more statistics for you. As I said, according to the CDC, 27% of the U.S. adults have a disability, according to the CDC. 12.1 have a mobility disability. 12.8 have a cognitive disability. 7.2 have independent living disability, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting, again, is take note of the fact that these numbers add up to more than 27%. So if you're a developer, a front-end developer, and you're thinking about, all the crap that you have to do to support different browsers, and then we add accessibility into the mix, you could easily be thinking about this. So how do we handle that? Like, how do we handle this situation? Well, fortunately, smarter people than me have come up with this idea of universal design. Anybody ever heard of it? And a lot of times, one of the things that I like to point out is this: that accessibility doesn't have to be ugly. Fortunately, there's a lot more people doing attractive stuff in accessibility these days, but there it was a long time, and you'll still see this at like accessibility conferences where like everything looks medical, you know what I mean? Everything looks plain Jane, it looks boring and gross and ugly, and that gives accessibility a bad name. But look at this. This is really cool. This is actually post office or postal service building. Post office department is what it says there in Washington, D.C. And of course, this is one of those fortunate situations that either they took that picture when nobody was around or somebody really good with Photoshop has gotten rid of the crowd. Because if you go here, because I've done it, if you go here, it's obviously a very, very busy place. And what you find is that most people actually walk in on these ramps rather than walk in straight in on the, just because of the way the building is oriented and the way that when you get into it, you're just like, oh yeah, I'll just walk. And what's great is this is also a picture perfect display of exactly what an ADA compliant ramp should look like, which is it should rise only 1 inch for every 12 inches of horizontal travel and all that. And it's attractive. It's really a good looking building. I have a whole presentation of this sort of stuff that I gave at a design conference, a really, really cool accessibility stuff, and I always love to use this one. Um, so, the point here, of course, is that a well-designed thing doesn't have to stick out like a sore thumb. We can use universal design practices to create a good user experience for everyone that also just happens to be accessible. And so the principles of universal design, a couple of good ones here. Giving users control. Giving users control of their own experience is a big deal, and one that a lot of people tend to think that we're going to just stick people into a specific type of interaction that we want them to go to. Well, like you see this in a lot of times when people create what are called wizards. Anybody know what a wizard is? Yeah. And there are certain cases where you're talking about a specific like linear flow, like installing software. We see a lot of wizards in installing software. And that's, of course, a perfect use case of that. But if you create a wizard type user interface for something else, let's say it's a long form or something like that, you're really stealing the control from the person. We also see this. We also see people getting control ripped from them when we disable form buttons. We disable the form button until the form is complete. And we think, well, we don't want them to submit the form unless they've given us all the information. No, actually, the best practice is to let them fail, tell them what they missed, and resume interaction from that. So that's one of the, so give users control. That's one of the principles of universal design. Offer choice. So this is a really cool example of offering choice. Basically, in this situation, what you can do, there's multiple types of things that you can do from here in your mobile email app. You can, obviously, you can trash it. You can just swipe it to trash it. You could have clicked it, opened it, and then trashed it, or you could choose more options here. But offering users the ability to do things in different ways is really, really important. There's actually a WCAG success criteria called multiple ways, and that talks about getting to things in multiple ways, not necessarily working on specific actions through multiple ways, but the principle is kind of the same. Swipe to delete, of course, that's another one that I missed. You could just completely swipe it to get rid of it. Next one is leverage familiarity. What's really interesting about leveraging familiarity is we don't have to slavishly copy like other people's designs to leverage that familiarity, but we should use metaphors and interactions that are familiar to people. As a matter of fact, if you look at all the design guides, the style guides for Windows, for Mac OS, for iOS, for Android, for all platforms out there, the style guides all talk about the importance of familiarity. There's this thing called, I've sort of stolen it, and I think it's later in my presentation, called the principle of least astonishment. It's actually more related to programming, but I think of it as a usability thing too. Like the act of doing something shouldn't surprise somebody. And what we find in accessibility is there's a lot of cases where accessibility problems sort of pile up in terms of the user experience, and frustrations tend to pile up into a way where it becomes a blocker. And so the more familiar operations, the more familiar iconography and things like that we can leverage, the best experience for everybody, especially people with disabilities. Consider the situation that the user is in. This is a really cool screenshot and something we're starting to see over and over nowadays, which is a lot of times people, well, unless you're a jerk, people will listen or will watch stuff on their phone with the volume turned either really, really way down or something like that, or might not have audio. And so captions are just on by default in a lot of cases, which is really cool. So consider the user and the actual context of use for your application or for your software. That's another one. Provide comparable experiences. So ensure your user interface provides a comparable experience for all users. And again, it's pretty similar as before. Another one is add value. Adding value. These are old examples, but it's really cool the way that you could you know, from your confirmation email from your flight. You can also add that to your Apple Wallet or your Passbook on Android or whatever it is, and so on and so forth. Open up Uber to get to it. If you open up Uber, it'll, you know, they also tend to have the ability to like see where you're going and where you've been and all that sort of stuff. It's really, it's important to do that, to predict sort of how the user is going to use the context of your thing and what else they can possibly want to do at the same time. And so here's the example, or see, here's the thing I was telling you about a second ago. The principle of least astonishment says the result of performing some operation should be obvious, consistent, and predictable. Anybody here into agile project management or any of that sort of stuff? So in agile, these two guys, Cunningham and Cunningham, were sort of pioneers of agile. And so they have this great wiki. It still looks like it was designed back in 1995. But it's a plethora of information on two things: agile and object-oriented programming. And that's what their quote was about, was actually object-oriented programming. But I call it the principle of least astonishment, and it's important for operating or for development. And in order to do that, you have to understand the platform. So prior to Afixed, I had a company called Tenon. Tenon was an accessibility testing product. The company Tenon was bought by Level Access. And I'm not rich enough to live my life on a yacht yet, so I gotta keep working. But Tenon was an automatic testing tool. It had an API. It came out before Axe and all that sort of stuff. But I had lots of insights into the error patterns that people had. Like I could look at the data and see what kind of messes people were making of code, and I could see a lot of times the accessibility problems people were creating were created because they didn't understand the actual way that stuff is created on the web, the way that objects are rendered to the screen. So I want to give you an example. When we think of a drop-down, right? What does a drop-down do? It's an HTML select element. What does that do? You just click it. It opens. There you go. You select one, right? Okay, so this is what it actually does. So HTML select element represents a control that presents a menu of options. The options within the menu are represented by option elements, which can be grouped by opt group elements. Options can be pre-selected for the user. Now, the tab moves focus into the field. A second tab key selects the current item on the list, updates the field's value, closes the drop-down list, and moves focus to the next focusable item in the tab order. Alt and down arrow or space opens the drop-down list, moves focus to the selected option. If nothing is selected, then focus moves to the first option in the list. If the combo box is not editable, then the space bar may be used to open the drop-down list. Up and down arrow keys move focus up and down the list. As focus moves inside the drop-down list, the edit field is updated, the value of the edit field. Enter selects the current item on the list, updates the value, highlights the selected item in the drop-down list, closes the drop-down list, and returns focus to the field. The escape key closes the drop-down list, returns focus to the field, and does not change the current selection. Typing a letter moves focus to the next instance of a visible node whose title begins with that printable character. As you keep typing, it keeps doing this autocomplete behavior. It also exposes these roles to assistive technologies, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So that gives you that autocomplete behavior as you keep typing. And so that autocomplete behavior is built in for free, right? Autocomplete is actually an accessibility feature that I'm sure you didn't know about. Autocomplete was created as an accessibility feature to reduce repetitive stress injuries from people who kept, having to type the same crap over and over again. Anyway, that autocomplete reduces typing by 25%. Cumulatively, they estimate that we've saved over 200 years of typing time per day. That's really cool. So let's talk about this concept of roles. In WCAG, if you've ever read WCAG, again, curing your insomnia, WCAG success criteria 4.1.2 is robust, right? It's under the robust criteria, and that's called name, role, and value. It should be name, state, role, and value, but it's name, role, and value. Anyway, what a role is basically what is this thing, right? So if you turn on a screen reader and you're listening to the screen reader and you get to a checkbox, it'll tell you it's a checkbox, right? It knows that because of this thing called an accessibility API. An accessibility API is a mapping of the objects from the DOM to system level objects that can then be rendered through to assistive technologies. Because the user needs to know, right? If they're on a checkbox and they can't see it, they need to know whether it's checked or unchecked, right? They need to know what they're checking. Same thing goes for radio buttons. Imagine you're on a radio button. It needs to tell you you're on a radio button. It needs to tell you how many radio buttons there are. It needs to tell you which ones there are, right? And so all of this stuff is exposed through an accessibility API. So this image I stole from a description of what's called the accessibility object model, but it shows you the interplay of a lot of these different things. So for instance, our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is basically just a polite request to a browser. It says, please, browser, can you render this thing the way I've instructed you with this text file? Because all you've created is a text file, right? So the browser's like, oh yeah, we can totally do this. So it paints it to the screen, right? And it also constructs this thing called the DOM. The DOM is an abstraction of what these things are. So in other words, if you type the HTML tag button, it's going to create in the DOM an object of type HTML button, right? And so that button, I'm going to get in a little bit into object-oriented programming, is an object that has methods and properties, right? Property is something that describes it, and a method is something that it can do. And so where we go wrong is I'm going to continue on with this. With the DOM is constructed, it's painted to the screen, and then the accessibility API also takes important pieces of that DOM to render that information to the user. So in other words, if you've ever inspected the DOM for a checkbox, you'd see all sorts of properties on there that are completely irrelevant for accessibility, like what the top leftmost pixel on the screen is. Screen reader doesn't give a crap about that thing. So it's the API is basically interpreting this DOM information by filtering out a bunch of stuff that's irrelevant. The irrelevant parts, of course, then are interpreted by the accessibility API, spat out through the speakers for the user. So why it matters that we know what the heck a select element does is because if we're using this select element, we need to use it for its intended purposes so that the user knows how to operate it, right? Because again, it's going to say, well, it depends on what screen reader you're using. If you're on VoiceOver on a Mac, it's going to say pop-up button, which has never made any sense to me. Pop-up button, it doesn't matter. The screen reader user knows, okay, pop-up button, that's a select element. But because we've used that tag correctly, because it's been interpreted in the DOM correctly, because the accessibility API itself is interpreted correctly, the user now knows I'm interacting with this thing. I can select one of these options. The way that you create accessibility problems is because you've not successfully answered for the user, what is this thing and what does it do? I'll give you a little bit of trivia. If you were to print out all of WCAG, including the extra information, the understanding WCAG and all that sort of stuff, you print out all that crap, you know, in the stack of papers, it's roughly the same amount of shit that a sheep creates in one day. And that's what I think about reading all that stuff, right? Because you only need to ask yourself one question when you're creating a user interface. What is this thing and what does it do? What is this thing and what does it do is going to be the thing that the person is asking themselves when they're interacting with the site. We automatically construct what's called a cognitive model of a user interface. As soon as the page loads on the screen, you can see it. You form this cognitive model of it. What's in the top left of every website? Logo that links where? To the homepage, right? It's a big website. What's in the top right? or search, right? It's at the very bottom of the site. Yeah, a bunch of stuff that lawyers and job seekers and investors look at, right? A bunch of secondary links and that sort of stuff. Like we know these conventions exist because we've formed that same cognitive model over and over and over and over and over again. You're on an e-commerce website, you get to a bunch of blocks on the screen. What are they? They're products, right? What is this thing? What does it do? You're answering that literally in fractions of a second in your brain. So as I said, there you go. So I wanted to mention before I go, before I close this talk and open for questions, is every single HTML element is mapped to something in an accessibility API. Every single one. The same thing goes for ARIA. So in ARIA, you may have heard a lot about it. In ARIA, every single ARIA role, state, and property is mapped to a role, state, and property in the accessibility API. Now, it could be something simple, right? In other words, a span element is just mapped to a text in the accessibility API, and that's fine. But when you're thinking about how am I going to use this thing, what is this thing and what does it do, has got to be the forefront of your question when you create the thing. And so this, if you wanted to see examples of how to do that, you have an idea of something, I want to create a tree menu. That's the hard part has already been worked out for you. Okay. So this should be, if you're ever in the situation of having to create custom user interface controls and all that sort of stuff, this is your Bible, the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide. Not only do they have this, but they also have the actual patterns themselves. They have, I think it's on there. All of them have examples on CodePen. Like you totally don't need to reinvent the wheel on any of that sort of stuff. So this is where I would go to learn how it should be, or to copy how it should work. That the detailed information in there also tells you about how it should work with the keyboard. All that sort of stuff's been worked out for you. Anyway, that's it for me. My name is Karl Groves. You can scan that doodad to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm actually not on Twitter anymore. You'll never guess why. And you can see me on these two websites.
Okay, so if you have questions and you can raise your hand, I will bring the microphone to you.
What has been your experience with the rise of like React and front end frameworks and how that has impacted accessibility in your work?
You know, there was a time when I remember a time when people would say, "Oh, jQuery is horrible and it's inaccessible and all that sort of stuff." It's kind of true. It wasn't until jQuery UI 1.9, which was a long time ago, of course, but that they actually did any of this ARIA stuff and did any of that stuff right. And so when React and Angular and all these sorts of things came out, they were also a hideous mess. But these days, there's a number of frameworks out there that already have all the accessibility baked in for you. For instance, I'm creating a new product for event management called Eventably, and I'm using the MUI framework in React. And so long as you use it correctly, you're golden. Like they've already done all that heavy work. So I love it. I mean, I'm a big... Most people don't know this about me, but I'm actually more of a back-end programmer than I am a front-end programmer. I love object-oriented programming. So when web components and that sort of stuff came out, I was like, yeah. And so I think it's great. So yeah, I think it's great for accessibility if it's done right and if you choose the right UI library. That's still the big deal. Any other questions?
If you're online and you have a question, please post it in the Q&A and I will read it for you.
Hi, my name's Alex. I'm with Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, web application developer. The question I have for you is, so we have recently, for instance, conducted an accessibility audit using some tools. We use Site Improve a lot, as well as just a manual audit.
Uh-huh.
And so now we have this giant list, like I think most people do, of 12,000 items that need to
Yeah.
be fixed over the whole site. So what are your recommendations for when it comes to prioritizing those? Because obviously we might not always have all the time in the world to
Yeah.
knock every single one of them out in a month.
Yeah.
But if we had to prioritize them, what kind of advice would you give?
So I have actually on my website, karlgroves.com, I have some blog posts on prioritization. But basically, there's a couple of factors that I think of when I think of prioritizing. First is user impact, right? And there's actually the way you got to think about it is not just low, medium, and high, but also number of populations impacted as well. So the way I put it together is if you have a high impact for any user population, then it's a high impact for all of them. If you have a medium impact for more than 2 populations, it's a high for all of them. And then the next factor is ease and speed of repair, meaning how fast can we ship an improvement?
Right.
And so if you think about this actually works out great with Hunch. Like it actually is validated by Hunch as well, which is if you think about alt text, right?
Yeah.
Fixing an alt attribute is super fast and probably is a huge impact for an end user. Fix it. You know what I mean? Same thing goes for color contrast. That's a huge deal. Same thing goes for form field labels and stuff like that. As a matter of fact, by volume, the 1, 2, and 3 most impactful and most prevalent things on the web are alt text for images, color contrast, and labels. And I don't just mean form labels. I mean labels for
Right.
anything.
Right.
Those are the 3
All
biggest.
the ARIA stuff.
So, but that's how I would think about it is like how many different types of disabilities are impacted, and also what's the ease and speed of repair of the thing. You know, because if you have to refactor something and it's going to take a long time but not really benefit a lot of people, I'm sorry, that thing's just got to go. You know what I mean? That's got to sit on the backlog. And I recommend using a Kanban style for this. You know what I mean? So that the important stuff always percolates to the top. You pick it off, you fix it, and you ship it.
Very cool. Thanks.
Hey, anyone else?
I was either because I was really good or I was really bad. Like there's no in between. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Karl, for sharing your insights with us. We got 10 minutes back on our time, so we're going to take an hour and 5-minute break for lunch. Feel free to eat in this room, the Arizona Ballroom, or Ventana. In the Arizona Ballroom, we will have someone coming to talk about the Folk Fest that happens in the spring. That's Gemma Garcia. And there's also an adaptive ski mechanism being set up outside of the Arizona Ballroom. So if you all want to go check that out, that's awesome. We'll return here for the session supporting neurodivergent learners in Canvas courses starting at 1 o'clock. But before you go, if you want to learn more or get involved in accessibility, consider joining one of our community groups. The ASU Digital Accessibility Liaisons meets monthly for ongoing accessibility training that is open to everyone at ASU. Or you can join the Universal Design and Accessible Technology group. That's the one that hosted the conference today. Information on both of these groups is available on the ASU Accessibility website at accessibility.asu.edu. And if you get a chance, please go to the schedule page of the conference. Sorry, I'm trying to read without my glasses on and hold a microphone. There is a QR code where you will find a post-conference survey. The first 500 people that fill that out for us get a free copy of Bellows' book that we will send you an electronic code to redeem an electronic copy of it. We appreciate your feedback on how we can make this event better. And thank you to all of our volunteers, our speakers who came from out of state, right, to talk. So we really appreciate all of you. Without you, this conference wouldn't be happening. So thank you so much.